Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise and speak to the Budget Implementation Act. As always, I have themes. Today I'm going to pick up the themes, things I'm glad weren't in the budget, things I'm glad were in the budget, things I wish weren't in the budget, and things I wish were in the budget, Madam Speaker. So we'll start out with things I'm glad weren't in the budget. First of all, the capital gains tax on people's house equity. This was a policy that had been floated in previous Liberal platforms, floated previously, and the Prime Minister said he wasn't going to include it. I'm glad it wasn't there because, people's equity that they have in their homes is typically part of their retirement plan. And as we have an aging population, the government needs to keep its hands off of our pensions and our home equity. The second thing I'm glad not to see in the budget is two of the recommendations that came from Finance Committee. There was a recommendation 430 that would have revoked charitable status for faith-based organizations, and recommendation 429, which would have revoked charitable status for pregnancy crisis centers. So with respect to faith-based organizations, there is no way that this government could afford to provide the service and compassion that faith-based organizations across the country are providing. And so I'm really glad to not see it there. I'm just concerned that it was even supported by the Liberals to come forward from Finance Committee. But it's part of a continuing war on people of faith in this country, as we see playing out right now in C9, where the government is cooperating with the Bloc to remove the protections under the criminal code for hate speech for people that are of faith, for them to be able to express themselves and read their scriptures. I don't really know where the Liberal government thinks they're going with this. 65% of Canadians are people of faith. And so to try to remove their charter rights to freedom of religion, it seems like counterproductive. So I hope the government will rethink that, but I was really glad not to see that one show up in the budget. In terms of the revoking the charitable status for pregnancy crisis centers, the Liberals are always talking about a woman's right to choose. And if a woman really has a right to choose, then some of them are going to choose to have babies, and they're going to need the pregnancy crisis center supports. And so I'm glad to see that that one didn't make it into the budget. The other thing that I'm glad we didn't see a lot of in this budget is the huge spending that we've been doing. Last year, $20 billion went to foreign nations for what I would consider to be, frivolous and ideological, stupidity, gender rights, and, there was $4 million sent off to Lebanon for multi-gendered, accessibility. Honestly, we have Canadians here in this country that are lined up at food banks, that can't afford to live. The priority has to be for Canadians. So I'm glad to see that none of those things made it in the budget. So now things I'm glad were in the budget. First thing I'm going to say, these are probably the only nice comments I'm going to make today, Madam Speaker, but the Building Communities Fund, $50 billion over 5 years for a number of things that are supposed to build infrastructure to get us to build affordable housing. And that will be really important in my riding, Madam Speaker, because, for example, we need storm sewer upgrades in Brook-Alvingston. We need stormwater upgrades in Warwick, Watford, and Arkona, potable water for Kettle Stony Point First Nation, and a stormwater system expansion in Lambton Shores, wastewater upgrades in St. Clair Township, and also for Point Edward. So, our priority in Sarnia-Lambton is to build affordable housing, and this is the infrastructure we need, so I will be petitioning the Minister to try to get some of the funding that we need in our riding. So that was one thing I was glad to see. The other thing that I would say I was glad to see was $600 million for stable funding for the status of women. If we look at the current situation in our country, especially important during these 16 days of activism for battling gender-based violence, and as we approach the anniversary of the École Polytechnique murders, we see that under the soft on crime Liberal policies, every other day we have a femicide in our country, and a sexual assault is up 76%. Now, women make up about half of the population, so absolutely there should be a priority on addressing that, and so I am happy to see that there is some stable funding there. Now, things I wish were not in the budget, Madam Speaker. Let's start with the $78 billion deficit. I do not know how these Liberals cannot understand that every time you put this kind of deficit spending into a budget, you are pouring fuel on the inflationary fire, and it drives the cost of absolutely everything up, and people simply cannot afford that. Also, that results in having to pay a lot more to service the debt. We will be paying $100 billion a year to service just the interest on the debt. It's like lighting up that money every year. Think about, that's more money than we put into our health transfers. Think of what could be done if we weren't paying off our debt, if we actually had some fiscal prudence, Madam Speaker. And, the other thing that I'm not happy about is to see that we're going to build, but what we're really building in this budget is bureaucracy. So instead of buying F-35s, we'll build a defense procurement bureaucracy. Why do we need that, Madam Speaker? We don't. We need to buy things that are going to help, our NATO allies to put us in a place where we can defend our sovereignty. Also, we're going to do the fourth housing bureaucracy. How many billions of dollars have we wasted creating housing bureaucracies that doesn't result in building houses? Housing starts are down again. So, Madam Speaker, I don't like that. And then major projects bureaucracy. I'm a fan of building major projects, but they haven't built a major project. There's been a lot of announcements of projects that were already underway, and now they're building a huge bureaucracy, and the government has shown they're terrible at major projects. They took the $4.5 billion Kinder Morgan pipeline, and they delivered it for $30 billion 2 years late. That's the kind of record that the government has, so they don't need more bureaucracy on that, Madam Speaker. And then the infrastructure bank. They've decided to give another $10 billion to the infrastructure bank. Well, this is a bank that, they took $35 billion from municipalities, and they have not really built many projects. In fact, last year they spent $4 million building projects, $38 million on salaries, $9 million on bonuses, and $204 million in losses. So why would you put more money into this kind of failing mechanism? The other thing I was unhappy to see in the budget, Madam Speaker, was that the government has put our Canada Pension Plan on the asset part of the government. Those are not the government's assets, Madam Speaker. Those are the assets of Canadians. Canadians and employers have paid into that program, and I really worry when the government gets their hands on something like that they're going to spend it as they do with everything else. So, Madam Speaker, the other thing I want to just highlight is some of the frivolous spending that I still see happening. It's happening on consultants, even though the government said that they were going to try to spend less, they're spending more. And they're still spending money on what I would call frivolous items. $150 million for gender awareness in other countries. $150 million to UNRWA, Madam Speaker, that has been proven to be helping Hamas build tunnels. $500 million for the European Space Centre, 50% of that space is owned by Brookfield. We saw lots of good deals for Brookfield and not too many good deals for Canadians, Madam Speaker. So, with that, things I wish were in the budget. First of all, something for seniors. In my riding, that's over half of the population, and we have an aging population in our country, but there's just a re-announce of the New Horizons program. How about an increase to OAS and GIS? How about something for young people, Madam Speaker? There was just a small amount for training after they've canceled the apprenticeship program, and we need more people in the trades. And actually, I would have wished that they had actually put something in there to build houses, to buy the F-35s, maybe money for jails, to put all of the criminals and repeat offenders and violent people that are out on the streets. And so, just to wrap it up, spend less to invest more. They're actually spending more. The public sector spending is up, consultants are up. We know this is going to cause the cost of everything to go up. And, they should be focusing instead on creating a competitive environment, R&D, reducing regulations, getting certainty so that investors will come and invest here in Canada, and get the government out of the way. Build, build, build at rates never before seen. Well, sadly, Madam Speaker, we've seen zero before, and we don't need to see it again. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Chief Government Whip.
Notwithstanding
the fact, Madam Speaker, that the Conservative argument around deficit spending and inflation was completely proven wrong when they said the same thing about the carbon tax. They said, the carbon tax is adding to inflation. The number of times that the parliamentary secretary and I listened to this for years in this House, we get rid of the carbon tax and inflation didn't suddenly get impacted by it. Notwithstanding the fact that there's that whole issue, the reality is that what she's saying is just not correct. I know we both went to the same university. She studied engineering, I studied economics. So take it from the person that studied economics that her rationale for fueling inflation with deficit spending, although it might work in theory in an isolated economy, just does not apply the same way when you have open borders to trade. Because the reality is that there's so much more that is impacting an economy and the inflationary pressures. Notwithstanding the fact that it doesn't play into the Conservative narrative that we've heard here for years, can she explain to me how global economies and free trade affect inflationary pressures the same way that she's telling me how deficit spending affects inflationary pressures?
The member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. And I certainly do recall him mocking this side of the House for 10 years on the carbon tax. And then we noticed during the election, the price of things started to fall, the price of gasoline. But what did the Liberals do afterwards? They returned, they put an industrial carbon tax in place, the supposed new fuel standard that increased the cost of gasoline 17%, that continues to increase the amount to grow the food, to move the food, to sell the food. And so they are driving inflation. If we look at it and we compare to our neighbors to the south, food prices here are going up 40% faster than in the U.S. because of this government's policies. Thank you, Madam.
Questions and comments. Honourable Member for Jonquière. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. In her speech, my colleague talked about the government's crazy spending in this budget at a time when Canadians are dealing with inflation on groceries and on other consumer goods. There's one spending that is absolutely crazy. It's the tax credit for carbon sequestration. Oil companies made record profits between 2022 and 2024. And now we're going to be paying for net zero oil, which is totally untrue. Does she think that this is crazy to have this once again in the budget to support to the oil and gas sector? The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. That's a good question because I'm not in favor of the Pathways project. I think all of the companies that are committed to this will be very rich. Brookfield is one of them. And I don't think that it will actually reduce emissions in Canada. We have to build a pipeline, and we have to sell our oil globally. And that's the right answer. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Peace River Westlock.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for her great speech on this. I think she mentioned in her speech, and I just wondering if she can clarify it a little bit more. Part 5 of Bill, Division 5 of Division 1 of this bill talks about $1.5 billion to the Canada Land Corporation. I'm just wondering if she can, I thought that this was a company that was supposed to sell off federal assets, and why are we giving them money to do that? Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And another excellent question from my colleague. The government's promises were that they were going to sell off land so that they could build the affordable housing that we're missing because of the massive immigration that did not match the supply of housing. And yet here we go. We see again that they're giving money. Who's getting rich, Madam Speaker? That's always the question with these Liberals. It's corruption. It's Brookfield. It's the Prime Minister getting rich. I'm just not certain exactly which Liberal insider is getting rich on this one, Madam Speaker.